All right, we're back into open session. Item 6B6 relates to the discussion that we had, or the topic. And that is discussion and possible action to amend the budget to fund acquisition of properties located adjacent to the county-owned properties. Any discussion or motions? Chair Gibbs.
I'll make a motion to approve and forward to the full board for its consideration Resolution 39-23 to amend the budget to fund the acquisition of properties located adjacent to the county-owned properties in the city of Wausau, Marathon County.
Is there a second? Second by Supervisor Hart. Any discussion? Any discussion? Again, this deals with property adjacent to the jail. If not, all those in favor of adoption of the resolution will signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed, no. That motion carries, and that will be advanced to the county board this evening. Next item is 7A, Property Management Policy and Disposition of Excess County Property. This issue was part of our committee work plan, and we have sort of not acted or done much on it. And I think we're at a point now with the social services building being vacant and other activities taking place relative to River Drive that we have a need to revisit that policy. In formulating that policy, I think it's important that we establish the process by which we will go, and we've got a wide variety of excess properties, and I think we've begun to look at that issue of those that we've taken through tax deed and we'll take through NREM through the use of the surplus property system. We may want to look at whether that's applicable for some of the other remnant parcels and other things that we own, but there are obviously, should we relocate the highway department, how would we want to handle that as we're moving out of and vacating all of the social services property, if we move out of River Drive. I think what we would like to know today perhaps is what factors, and we're not going to discuss them or act on them today, but we'll just identify them. Would you want to see us factor in to the discussion as we move ahead and we look at that policy of how do we deal with excess properties? And I think one of the things that might be helpful is if we could develop an inventory of and sort of categorize those remnant parcels, tax deed parcels, and other parcels that are surplus for the county, and then look and see whether or not we want to handle those separately. But are there other factors that you would want? And I would point out that under Chapter 75 of the statutes, when we take things through tax deed, there's the ability of the local government to weigh in and take title to that property. Is that something that we might want to do? Or, are there other factors that you would like to see us consider and discuss in the future?
Mr. Chair, you're looking for me for at least my comment. I'll offer, as I did at your last meeting, kind of a little bit of additional context information. I did reach out, this is some time ago, to an individual that was very active, was an economic development professional for a local municipality here for a number of years, to just kind of get their sense on, what information might the county, this committee and the county board want to look at. And I don't know that this is going to be entirely helpful, but the information she offered was, really that there are a lot of property-specific considerations that might go into the ultimate determination from a governing body on the direction to provide to staff relative to divestment. One of the things she offered was, really having a discussion relative to each of the pieces of property you're talking about, and we can do that inventory to kind of move this forward, but maybe it's each of the categories, having some consideration given to whether or not the property has significant economic development value. Most of our tax deed properties fall into kind of the residential what I'll call the residential side or category. You have remnant parcels that really probably have very little, if any, economic development value. There might be value to the adjoining parcel, that property owner. But then you have, as we've really talked about, kind of the larger parcels. You talk about River Drive, the Thomas Street building, West Street. Those are at least have some discussion, and you had some discussion relative to West Street, for example, in your West Side Master Plan discussion. So I think economic development potential is one of those categories that we should include. But other than that, and I referenced this last time, I still don't have any information on whether or not we'll be selected, but because this is something that the county hasn't directly had a large role in, the idea of divesting ourselves of significant economic development potential property isn't something we've had to do recently. I did reach out and apply for that fellow position, fully funded fellow position. Haven't heard back on whether or not we'll get that, but UW Extension, as I referenced at your last meeting, is willing to help us go through the planning process. The other piece of property that, again, I think gets into that economic development, whether it's economic development or residential potential, significant residential potential, is the UW Stevens Point Wausau campus parking lot that's to the north side of 6th Street. We've maintained that parking lot for a period of time, but it's not of value to the university. They have essentially told us, do with it what you want. So getting some direction on that as well.
On the same lines, I think there's several things that we need to consider when we talk about divestment. One is what is current value. I think the other, as alluded to, was the economic development potential, which leads to what's the potential revenue projections that could be generated for the county. And then I think we do have to pigeonhole each property separately, because one of the things that's not clear under the Supreme Court ruling that took place for the property taking over in Minneapolis was, what is the value of property if the county were to own tax deed property? Is there a requirement to determine that value and the difference between the county's debt that it has on the property and the full value of that property? Is if we own the property and continue to own the property, are we required to provide that payment back to the property, the previous owner? We don't know that answer to that question. So there's some questions that are still in the air that as it relates to tax deed properties. Some of that's going to hopefully be answered, or at least addressed, as to whether or not they're going to be answered in the upcoming WCA webinar on that Supreme Court case. But I think the things that we really need to look at is current value, potential economic development value, and then revenue value that potentially is there on those properties. That would, especially the ones that are developable for commercial.
Yeah, Supervisor Lemmer.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm going to show a little vulnerability here because I don't know really what I'm talking about, but I did attend a Synergy Region Economic Development Organizations and Municipalities meeting in June, and they talked about something called certified sites. I don't know if you're familiar with those, but would that be something we would be able to do to anything that we have, or is that not applicable?
My understanding is that's more industrial park sites to have certified economic development sites, but Chris, you might have more experience. Yeah, I think my understanding is having those certified sites are for generally economic development sites within industrial parks. But I can look into that just to confirm. I don't know if anyone else has better information.
Not about that.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Wondering if we need to have any sort of policy provisions regarding, like, are we going to be proactive about putting things for sale, or are we more like going to wait until there's an interested party? and, what's the difference between those two approaches maybe. I think that's kind of my biggest question right now, just because we do have a lot of properties in the pipeline, and quite a few of them are large and prime for economic development. But are we simply waiting for someone to come to us, or are we going to try to put it on the market?
But I think that's a good question, and some of that might be enlightened as it deals with the tax delinquent property at the next meeting when we deal with those policies. But it's an excellent question of timing and resources, and I think that's one of the reasons why Chris has advanced the use of the surplus property. Go ahead.
Another thought is, often we hear, there's a lot of properties being exchanged or sold from municipality to municipality, government through government. Would that be an aspect that we need to consider that would be different from selling to a private entity?
That gets into that Chapter 75 discussion. Other factors? I think this is helpful in creating an outline. So we've heard issues of value, both current and future, economic development potential, revenue value. How do we factor in individual factors into those? Keeping them in, I will say, certified sites. I think that the one thing we didn't discuss is housing. I know that some of the city is aggressive relative to Thomas Street, and we've got one tax delinquent property on Thomas Street. But to look at those categories, when do we sell, how do we sell, other factors that we can build in, looking at our current policies and what the policy changes might need to be.
Can I offer one additional thought? In my conversation with UW Extension staff, they referenced the importance or potential value, I guess is a better way to say it, the potential value of an already existing development plan within the municipality for the piece of property that the county owns. Perhaps that would be something that some direction from this committee and the full board would be helpful on. So stated differently, if the property that we own is already within an area that has an existing economic development plan. So for example, the River Drive properties, the city had done, I believe it was in 2018, 2019, started a economic development plan for those properties. The county participated in that. It was funded by the city, and the county, as well as other existing adjacent landowners, participated. WPS was one. So getting some insight, it kind of similar to what Chair Gibbs referenced, under the tax deed process, or I believe it was Chair Robinson, the municipality has the opportunity to purchase a tax deed property kind of before it goes on the public market. So we make that outreach, understanding what, if any, value the county puts on an existing economic development plan would be perhaps something to get some direction.
Yeah.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Is that when the local government takes that title, is it at what is on the tax roll, or is it at the appraised value?
It's a negotiated agreement under the statutes. Typically, it's for what cost we have into it, or it can change. It can, I know in the past we've taken less, but the goal is to take it, but those are negotiated agreements.
Okay. I think that we should look at current value as a large thing, as well as the economic development of it, but to just protect the county, I think we need to look at current value.
And that'd be one of those factors we would bring back. Supervisor Leahy.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I think the administrator's previous comment kind of got me thinking about the concept of priorities. I know we were trying a new approach with the budget, and perhaps that could be a lens through which we could look at this process as well. Yeah, I know we have complicated relationships with weighted systems in a lot of our processes and policies and assigning numbers to things, but we're throwing out these major concepts like what are our priorities when we're looking to sell a property? Is it purely making some sort of revenue profit? Is it a community goal? Maybe just to have some of those things in mind as we're crafting the policy.
Chair Gibbs.
Yeah, to Supervisor Marshall's point, I think we have to look at fair market value, especially on tax deed properties, in light of that Supreme Court decision. I think that's potentially going to hamper somewhat what might have been allowable in negotiations under Chapter 74 before, because we could have negotiated a sale of that tax deed property to the municipality for what we had against it. But in light of the potential that there is a difference between fair market value and the cost that the county has against it, in light of that Supreme Court decision, we'd have to weigh that into the factor.
Other questions? Other questions? All right. I think we've got some guidance going forward. I thought this was going to take a lot longer. So we have a full agenda, surprise, surprise, for early August. We'll bring back the ARPA resolution for reconciliation. I think we're waiting for some updates from Molly and company relative to some of the policies that we can do as an employer. And there's a number of other items that we kicked down. Workday update. Sometime in August, we'll have that North Central Healthcare update. Supervisor Marshall's been asking for, and others. And we've got a number of things in the queue. Any other things that you'd like to see us take up? And again, I encourage you tomorrow, if you can, join the shared revenue discussion. Andy Phillips sort of set it up and on Monday, saying that there's a lot of technical details associated with that Act 12, AB 245, that will impact local governments. Chair Gibbs.
Yeah, just to give a little bit of an update, there was some clarity provided around the funding on the increase in shared revenue. 50% of the increase will be delivered to the county in the July payment, and the other 50% we will receive in the November payment. So now, but that clarity was provided, and then also the clarity around the net increase is resetting of the base.
All right. If there are no other items, number 9 is in order. Supervisor Hart moves to adjourn. Is there a second? Seconded by Supervisor Lemmer. All those in favor of adjournment will signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed, no. That motion carries.